Shlomo and hello again, this is Elka with what will probably be our final current session on the differences between Protestantism or evangelicalism and the Syriac Orthodox faith. Today's topic is going to focus on the biblical canon and the topic of inerrancy. So I wanted to introduce you to the Protestant understanding, in particular, I should add, from the North American continent, that is expressed in what is called the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy. This statement was drawn up in October of 1978, and it basically states that the concept involves that all the canon in its Protestant 66 book form is without error in what are called its autographs. So autographs being the original manuscripts that were written. Mind you, one of the issues that we have in the Christian world is that we do not have those very first autographs or original documents. We do, however, have many manuscripts that were copies and often very faithfully copied of the New Testament in particular. But I wanted to show you one book that I have in my library. It's called Biblical Inerrancy. And in particular, it's called 5 Views on Biblical Inerrancy. And I actually wanted to read from this book for just a second, a little bit, to give you an understanding. Quote, "Inerrancy, then, is not a mere statement about Scripture for evangelicals. Since Scripture is the source of evangelical faith, and since inerrancy is ultimately a matter of reading Scripture faithfully, inerrancy is often regarded as the essence of genuine Christian faith." So this is the quote from the book that I'm holding. And 5 different scholars had offered opinions on this. And one of the things that my good friend Michael Bird, who is a New Testament professor from Australia, said here is that this International Council on Biblical Inerrancy, this is a quote from him, was not an ecumenical council with representatives from near and far, representing all traditions, bringing collective wisdom to bear on the doctrine of Scripture. It looks to me to be mainly a conservative, in-house American thing. The International Council was international to the same extent that winners of the World Series or the Super Bowl are world champions. So that is an interesting quote. And in some of the responses, some of the respondents actually address that they are saying this gets back to Bird's concern that inerrancy is basically a modernist concept, and also that inerrancy is something that was then done in not so much of an international context, but much more of a North American context. That was the response by Albert Mohler in particular, for those of you familiar with the evangelical house. So let's lay that aside, but the important thing is that this results in the concept of the Bible and the Bible only, or sola scriptura as it's called in evangelical circles or in Protestant circles. And this is really an insistence that in particular for organizations, for example, the Evangelical Theological Society, that you have to sign off on a statement that declares that the Scripture in their autographs are inerrant, and that only those 66 books are applicable to the Christian faith and the rule of faith. So these are worthy of protection, and basically no questions are to be asked about the inerrancy of the text. It is supposed to be the framework of all that we as Christians believe. So let's then switch to the Syriac Orthodox side, and I wanted to go back to what I had mentioned before, that we in the Syriac Orthodox world have what's called the Peshitta. And so along with the other churches of the East, this is our own version of the Bible, and it's translates to simply meaning simple. And notably, the same hermeneutical rigor that we see in Protestantism is not applied, or is less visible, I would say, in particular when it comes to oral transmission. So in other words, how the text was orally transmitted. And we'll address that in just a second. But I did want to say that George Kiras, who is the publisher and was very engaged with this project, had a couple of statements that I just wanted to read to you from the introduction of the Peshitta English New Testament, the Antioch Bible English translation, and that is he's the editor, and that was of course published by Gorgias Press. So when I look at this, he writes that the Peshitta Bible dates back to the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. By the end of the 2nd century, Syriac users had translated most, if not all, of the Old Testament into their own language. So that was the Old Testament. Now the New Testament took a little bit longer. We do have a complete version by the 5th century, if I remember correctly. And also noteworthy is that, I'm reading again from the preface here to this edition, the Peshitta does not contain the entire New Testament as we know it today. This is not because the Peshitta is lacking or inferior, it is actually because the Peshitta represents an early form of the New Testament. So it's interesting to note that there are several books that are simply not part of the Peshitta. So there are no Peshitta manuscripts for the minor general epistles, so 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude. And the canonicity of those books was even disputed up to the 4th century in the Greek texts or Greek manuscripts. And the same applies to the Revelation, which was entirely absent from the Peshitta. I again want to point out to you that George Kiras did a great interview recently with the Logos podcast from the Netherlands. So you may want to look up the Logos podcast on YouTube. And he discussed that at great length. So the other thing that's really important is that there is a bit of elasticity built into the Peshitta, in the sense that there had to be fluidity, there had to be elasticity because of the language environment and the various Aramaic dialects in the broader region that were working with the Peshitta text. And so what that means is that a priest might be reading from the Peshitta in the original form in the Syriac, but then on the fly translate that, for example, into Turoyo. And the great happening that I had, the great occurrence of seeing this live, was very recently in Germany, in my home church, Morhat Pschabo in Polheimhausen outside of Gießen, where the priest reads the Holy Gospel in Syriac, but then on the fly translates that for the congregation into Turoyo, which is a dialect of Aramaic and which they can understand, while they might not understand the Kthobonoyo or the liturgical Syriac. So this level of elasticity is just readily apparent in the Syriac Orthodox world. And it should, however, be noted that the written transmission, on the other hand, was very faithfully done. And we have documents dating back many centuries. And as a matter of fact, we can proudly say that the oldest gospel manuscript is actually, the oldest preserved gospel manuscript is actually in Syriac, and it was written in Edessa in the year 510. So there is a strong commitment to preserving the faith also on the Syriac Orthodox side, but it should be understood that this discussion of inerrancy was never part of our scripture transmission. So this is only a very brief introduction to the topic, but I hope maybe if you're a Protestant listener that this makes you kind of scratch your head and say, I need to read up on this a little bit more. I need to understand this better, especially if you're from the North American continent, where this Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy has caused just such rigidity in how we interact with each other as fellow Christians. So with that, I'm going to conclude this brief series on the differences. We'll probably do some videos to try to dig into some of the topics in a little bit more in-depth versions. I'd also love to hear your questions. What would you like to hear about? What would you like me to expound on? And most of all, I want to thank you for being with me on this brief journey. It's definitely very brief, but I hope it was helpful. And again, correct me if I said something wrong. And thank you for being with me through this journey so far. More videos to come. I'll have to figure out what they will be about. So any questions you have, please ask them. Thanks, and may the Lord bless you and keep you until the next video. Bye.